Hey everybody, I'm Joey Hungerford. Welcome back to the Disciple Makers YouTube channel. In this series, talking about simple church to help equip you, whether you're a small group, Bible talk, house church. I hope that this is a blessing. Stick around for the full video to learn about contextualization. That's not only missional contextualization, but how does a group at your size, with your capacity, meeting as a smaller group, how do you contextualize to that? What social context makes the most sense? How do you avoid the intensity of a small group and the formality of a Sunday service when you're just trying to relate to people and build a relationship? We did house church in my home in Redmond, Oregon for a season, and we actually extracted a lot of disciples who were coming to our church. They lived in nearby Bend, Oregon, so they drove about 30 minutes to come to house church. And hey, that kind of living room setting, we were able to be more vulnerable with each other, have more discussion, put on some more potlucks, and not for lack of trying, we didn't get many neighbors to actually come. I invited lots of them, served lots of them, but ended up engaging neighbors more through praying for them, having conversations on their own lawn, figuring out how to serve them, like through the local food project. And so even though we were meeting for church right there in my neighborhood, most of them had some preconceived notion of church. That wasn't something they were really interested in. They'd rather come on a Friday night when we were having a party or some other social function. Two events got more neighbors involved than anything else. One, we assembled care bags for the houseless. And while neighbors didn't come on the care bag assembly night, two of them donated money and two others donated food. And then after that, I started collecting food on a monthly basis from neighbors for the local food bank. And they knew that I was a person meeting local needs by collecting food, so they were always asking about it. Another event was we had a Friendsgiving, just a big long table in our dining room. Some people came from our church, but mostly it was neighbors, mostly people who we didn't really know. And we were able to engage in spiritual conversations, just talk about, what are you thankful for? Well, I'm thankful for salvation in Jesus Christ. These events seemed to incarnate Jesus further into our neighborhood, further into lostness, than inviting people to a church context. Missiologist Alan Hirsch reckons that only about 40% of the population would consider coming to a sacred space or a church context. I've heard statistics as low as only 30% of people are interested in accepting a church invite. So it's the success of those other two events that shows we need to go to the 70%, figure out how to meet them and reach them where they're at. It means that we had to lean into social contexts where we could develop relationships with neighbors, like the backyard barbecue, rather than a public context like a church setting where people are expected to sing and take communion and have a lecture taught to them, which is kind of an awkward thing for somebody who's new. And this idea of how Jesus can incarnate, how he can be translated to people in a local context, is known to missionaries as contextualization. Just imagine all of the subgroups and subcultures and affinity groups and hobbyists and all the different stratas of your own local city. How can Jesus be made real to them? And each of those groups has the latent potential for the gospel to be contextualized to them, true to who Jesus is calling them to be, to become disciples, become a church, reaching that niche of people. So let's get into the Word of God and talk about this contextualization. You know, in Acts chapter 8, verses 1 through 4, it says, "And there arose on that day great persecution against the church in Jerusalem. And they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentation over him. But Saul was ravaging the church and entering house after house. He dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. Now those who were scattered went about preaching the word." Those who were scattered went about preaching the word in Acts 8. This is known as the diaspora. And it's important because they were scattered to places where they didn't have their classic Jewish temple context. They had to figure out what church would look like in their new village, in a new culture, within new empires. This Greek word diaspora, it refers to the Jewish people during their Babylonian exile. It also refers to the Hellenized Jews during the Roman Empire period. They were spread all around. They had to figure out how to contextualize church to where they were at. So yes, persecution multiplied the church and they were able to spread out, but the gospel was also able to travel along relational lines with people who knew how to make sense of the gospel to their local context, to their own culture, space, and their existing households, their oikos. As it said, Paul went about house to house, persecuting them. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 22 through 25 says, "For Jews demand signs, and Greeks seek wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men." Jews demand signs, Greeks demand wisdom. Two different groups, the message is the same, Christ crucified, but signs and wisdom, it's different to different people. Acts chapter 17 verse 16 says, "Now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was being provoked within him, as he was beholding the city full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him." He's in Athens with Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. And he ends up, his spirit being provoked. He looks at their idols. He looks at their city. He makes observations. He actually quotes back some of their own poets to them. And really every church Paul planted, it looked different in each city. In Philippi, he converted a jailer and a slave girl. In Lydia, and a whole mob erupted. But in Athens, he reasoned with them. A different approach for a different mission to a different people. Yes, he reached the Jews in the synagogue, but he knew that his approach to the Greeks would need wisdom and reasoning. So it's not one size fits all, but a church that's calibrated to the mission, that's calibrated to what Jesus would look like in that place. So here they were, the early church, on these mission trips and the scattered people under the persecution, having to figure out what were the underlying values of what it meant to be church. How could they be a light to the nation still where they were at? How could they be a gathered people meeting with God in a specific place? And they ended up gathering with natural relationships around God's word and breaking of bread and communion and worship and listening for what the Lord's specific calling was in their context. They sought to be a blessing to their local community, to the lost, to the least, and to the last. And they found innovative and authentic ways to proclaim the good news to the people around them. Think about all of the one another commands in the New Testament. There's more than 50 of them, but you probably can't practice all of them with a large church. They're meant to be lived out in the Oikos sized church, the household size of something under 70 people, these natural relationships that already existed around them. It's for that reason that I think this Oikos context, or this social context, is the most effective size for multiplying the mission and authentic community. It's the most crucial space for this formation. Think about it. It's a low-risk space for neighbors to get to know you with, 20, 30 people at a backyard barbecue. They can walk away from a conversation if it's a little bit awkward, and they're not put on the spot like a small group of 10 people asking them a specific question. It doesn't have the intensity of a small group or the formality of a Sunday service. It doesn't mean that those other spaces aren't important, but they should be taken in stride. A Jew in the first century was a part of a synagogue of usually less than 70 people. They only went to the larger temple once or twice a year, much like our public church context. And the truth is, we need big and small, both gathered and scattered people to work in tandem rather than being opposed to each other. They have incredible strengths, but in order to utilize them, they need to recognize their unique purpose. So let's talk about how to work this out. If you're in a big established church, then the method and formula for ministry is probably very well cemented and established. But if you're in a house church, you're probably more flexible and agile. And because of that, you can contextualize much, much better. You can excel with flexibility and creativity. It's actually a strength for you to translate the good news to a greater diversity of people and the people who are right around you in your world. Small groups that mobilize every type of person, as house churches and simple churches do, have the potential to reach every type of person, whereas a large gathering on a public context Sunday morning may only reach a small percentage of our population. I warn you, if you're a simple church or house church though, and you're trying to strive for the public context of the legacy church, it may be biblically unprescribed and it may be uncontextualized to your own local neighborhood, and you might be setting yourself up for an unrealistic expectation and burnout. Some quick definitions to clarify this. Simple church is just something that replicates the mission based on shared values. It's a group of people with the DNA of worshiping together, committing to each other, and undertaking mission together. They have that one another covenant. It's an expression of church for an extended spiritual family. Whereas the prevailing model of church, or sometimes we say it is the established or legacy or traditional church, it replicates the formula based on tradition. They have a brand or a franchise and they double it and multiply it. Example, it might be a group of people with the DNA of going to church to listen to announcements and 3 songs, contribution, a welcome, communion sharing, and a polished 30-minute sermon. Church planting for them then may not mean making disciples, but simply starting a church service that has those elements. And that's okay. We have a tendency to define church by those specific details that are most tangible to us, to define it by what we do rather than why behind it. So none of those things are wrong, having announcements or guitar-led worship, but remember that they're a little more descriptive than prescriptive. And if you define church by what, then those things will quickly be set in stone. If you define church by why you do what you do, then you have the freedom to innovate. If you find church by why you do what you do, the underlying values, then you will have freedom to innovate and be more effective. And in house church or simple church networks, we hold each other accountable to the why and to the values of, hey, community, mission. How are you expressing those? The what is for you in your own local autonomy to dream about and to come up with vision for. But your mission will probably look a little different than my mission. For example, some churches may experience worship by having a worship band. Others may experience true and proper worship by serving at the local soup kitchen. Some churches may have communion with the bread and the juice. Other churches might have an agape love feast where they're actually talking about Jesus rather than sitting in silence to proclaim his death, burial, and resurrection. I want to encourage you to encourage others to have that localized autonomy of the what and the how, because it empowers disciples to dream. It gives them passion and ownership to be self-sustaining rather than burnt out trying to meet your expectation. But do give them centralized support and accountability and agreement over the shared values. It's good to encourage each other on a minimum standard that we want to uphold. And that'll ensure that the local church is truly contextualized rather than just copying your brand or your idea. Now, I have other videos linked in the description for incarnational mission and how to contextualize further, but one of the best things a church can do is just get out of the church building and not be a holy huddle and cuddle, but actually be missional and connecting with the community. I want to talk about the 5 contexts of discipleship. These have been developed by sociologists. They've proven true over the decades, and Bobby Harrington and others with the Renew Network, they've added another context to spiritualize these sociological contexts. And these are just 5 different spaces of relationship that you should discern to see at your church size where you can best build relationships to build up disciples and reach new people. First is the public context, where people gather in the hundreds, probably around a shared resource. It might be an event, an experience. Think of fans at a pop concert, or it might be some public figure, or even on social media. Think of a live stream. And if the resource is physically present, people will generally be at least 12 feet away from it. Think about somebody up on a stage or a theatrical play. In this environment, the focus is on engaging with the outside resource and consuming a service rather than building relationships with others. who also happen to be there next to you. Next, the social context is a range between 20 and 70 people, where you seek to build affinity with others. Think your backyard barbecue, where a few things happen. You build neighborly relations, people you could call upon for minor favors perhaps, and connections and networking, but you also start to identify people to whom you could potentially become closer friends with. You find common interests. You begin to reveal elements about yourself, about your identity and your journey. And you're probably somewhere between 4 and 12 feet apart, close enough to shake somebody's hand. Next, the personal context is groups of people from 4 to 12. And that's where you probably feel comfortable enough to share private information. Think about some friends grabbing drinks together, sharing personal thoughts and feelings about their lives and relationships. You might be 18 to 24 inches apart so you can hear each other better and lean into each other. You're comfortable, you're at touching different distance. People can see you for who you are, warts, wrinkles, and all. Next, the transparent context. Groups of 2 to 4 people. Think about your closest relationships. The transparent context is characterized by openness and candor. Nothing is held back. Think about being naked and unashamed biblically. Think about your spouse and how vulnerable you are with her. Marriage is actually a good place where this is lived out. Think about your best friends. You could be 0 to 18 inches apart. There is proximity and safety. Lastly, the divine context. If we're Christians and disciples, this is a key part to our spiritual formation. It's your daily quiet time. It's where God directly interacts with us in the one-on-one level. So it shifts from cultivating relationships to just being alone with your Creator and Redeemer. And this is where you also come face to face with your true self, reflecting on the Word of God. This is where you realize who you truly are in the loving eyes of the Father. And this communion with God, in turn, equips you to engage more fruitfully with other relationships in those other contexts. A bonus one that I made up is the 6th transitional context. This is for calibrating all of these other 5, depending on your situation. Because what if you don't have enough people to operate at the social context? What if you're only a group of 5 or 10? How can you then be effective? Well, if you're in that transition period, it may be effective for you to act up. Act up to the next context. Act a little bit above your size, as long as it's within your capacity. And maybe you don't do it on a weekly basis, but maybe you can throw a monthly party to hit that social context. Act as if you're the size you want to be. Put out the extra chairs. Usually it's effective to act your age. But if you're trying to act up, say, be within the public context of church, you'll probably want to put out more chairs so that you can someday have that. If you are acting up, it's going to take a lot of your energy. So inviting people is top priority. When we acted up in my house church, we would put on a big party, but I would make sure to invite a lot of people. So our ratio was about 50% guests, 50% disciples, and then we could have 20 plus people and have a social context. But if you're not inviting that many guests, it's difficult and you might burn out from acting up. So don't act up too far or skip contexts in the table. Don't add on more programs or events than you can take on. Otherwise, you will probably burn out your small group from trying to be and act like a big group. Another principle is that in our modern urban world, relationships are more with friends, and we find ourselves in apartments rather than in family networks or that larger extended Oikos. And people live incredibly busy lives. They're often tired in the evening. And in this culture, groups end up being smaller because it's what works pragmatically. They're still defined by the key valued outcomes of those contexts, but they're probably going to look smaller. Thus, the social context kicks in at around 12 or 15 people. And that personal context, that D group or small group size, might work best in single digits. And remember, the contexts are a means to an end, not an end within themselves. So a few missteps and dysfunctions that can happen in these contexts. And remember, you want to utilize them so they can be working for you to be more effective. Here's how they could work against you. In the public context, you might try and share private information with the person who is placed next to you by chance. He happened to just sit in the pew. So if you were asked to pray together or confess sin together, this wouldn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't make him your best friend. Something like a discovery Bible study with high commitment and accountability and vulnerability may not work if people have certain expectations in the public context. If they're coming to consume and be served and they're not looking to be consistent. You could have a misstep in the social context if you're expecting it to be that public context and something to be consumed rather than a mutual interaction, shared contribution. Again, think about the potluck. Everyone chips in somehow. And you might make this context too close, too quickly, and too personal. You might get in a fight with your spouse at the backyard barbecue. That's awkward. That's a little too personal. You might break down crying or start sharing your sin at a Bible talk or Bible discussion, which is not really meant for depth, but meant to be light and engaging. In the personal context, you might have a misstep of sharing with other people what was shared in the personal context. That's a place for some discretion. You might also be tempted to just remain a small group and not have an outward focus if you're very comfortable with this friend group. Because naturally, you are getting very deep with each other. You are sharing very close things. You don't want that to be interrupted. You don't want anyone to divide you guys. But there can be a tempting thought that, well, if we just get ourselves right first, if we just have enough spiritual formation and healing, then we'll just naturally be people that others will want to come and be around. Or when we're finally 100% perfect, then we'll go back to being outward. And the truth is, people are always growing. There's always another problem to fix. You're never going to be fully perfect or know everything to where you're ready to be missional. You have to have a both and. In the transparent context, you might have a misstep of trying to organize that, like handing out a sheet that says, hey, this is your discipling partner, the person you're supposed to be best friends with and confess sin with. The smaller the context, the more it's better for people to choose themselves organically who they pair well with. You can't really engineer it. A misstep in the divine context is thinking you can control this, turn it into a checklist or a formula, effectively trying to control Jesus or get something out of him. You know, guys, at the end of the day, let the mission drive your model rather than coming up with a model and trying to squeeze in mission on the side. I hope that this video on contextualization helped you to discern your relational context where you can be effective in discipleship and in outreach so that the gospel can be translated to the people around you to whom God has called you. Don't forget to check out the blog in the description for more on this principle. I hope this blessed you. Have a great day.